thought we'd do is last week we were taking a look at Ezekiel.
And Bob, your image is not showing here.
It is over here.
Oh, it is? Okay, never mind then.
I see it.
Yeah.
It's good to me.
You got the perfume.
Jeez.
Okay, we're good.
Okay. All right, so I got John Mills, he can see us. Marilyn, hi Marilyn. And Bob. So I thought what I'd do tonight, and we haven't gone into great depth and detail regarding Ezekiel 38 and 39. We started to look at it last week. It's something that we probably need to spend some time on, and we'll just, again, touch on a few key points again tonight because it's so relevant. And it is what many people believe is very likely the next thing or the next event on God's timetable. And I think, as I mentioned, that Ezekiel 38 and 39, but 38 is a prophecy about a confederation of nations led by Russia, Iran, Turkey, then Libya and Sudan, which is kind of an interesting situation right now. But it's a confederacy of nations that Ezekiel prophesied would at some point in the future make a move or attempt to attack Israel. And we know that this is a yet future prophecy because nothing like this has ever happened. And so it's yet future. And we know also that Ezekiel 36, 7, 38, 39, etc. are chronological, which means that if we go to 36 and 37 particularly, it's stated that the Jews have to be back in the land before this event can take place. And so what occurred on May 14th, 1948, not that long ago, really set in motion a lot of events and a lot of prophecies that we're watching come into shape today. And when we talk about Ezekiel 38, it's clear based on what we're seeing that certain things have to happen in order for the timing and the actual event to take place. And by certain things, it means that there has to be relations between Iran, Turkey, and Russia, which is something that has not existed before. In fact, Turkey has historically, or at least the last several decades, been a member of NATO. And we know that NATO was established as an organization of nations to deal with Russia, the threat of Russia. And so you have NATO and Russia basically on two sides of the aisle. But now what we're seeing is a relationship developing between Turkey and Russia. And of course, we have Iran in the mix as well. So how do we know that we're approaching the time of the fulfillment of this particular prophecy? Is that for the first time, and I think I mentioned this last week, and I'm sure I'll mention it again, the first time in recorded history, those three nations, groups of people, are together in Syria fighting one battle or another. Iran and Russia basically on the same side, Iran being a Shia nation, Turkey being more of a Sunni organization. And what's really interesting is that after Israel became a nation for the longest time, Israel and Turkey had relations. They were friendly with one another, and Turkey was, for the most part, it was a secular state. But they have a new leader now by the name of Recep Erdogan, who is a radical Muslim. He is probably, and I just don't understand why the media is not paying more attention to this, but he's probably the most dangerous other than Xi in China, who is obviously very dangerous, but Erdogan is probably among, if not the most dangerous leader in the world today.
I think they're starting to watch. Last night on the news, it came across with Iran and Russia attacking into our election and everything else.
Right, right.
And the FBI and everybody
Yeah.
is involved.
We saw that. Yeah,
So they are watching.
yeah. Oh, right.
And Turkey
No.
is also going into Armenia,
Right, right.
which for me is a concern because my husband was
Ah,
Armenian.
yeah,
My children are half Armenian.
yeah. That's
So, I mean, they killed 3 million Armenians. Let's
Right.
not forget that.
yeah,
During
they-
the First World War,
right.
when they're going back in.
Yeah, I'm not sure people understand that, and I'm not sure I fully do. But Turkey during the First World War
It was
slaughtered
3
Oh.
million Armenians.
6 million Armenians.
They did.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm not sure they've ever been held to account for
They
that.
have never thought, though, when he ran for president, he was the only one that was gonna recognize
Right.
the Armenian genocide. Because it was a genocide. My in-laws were children, and they walked to get a boat to Syria. So it was the first real known genocide against the people,
Hmm.
because Armenians are Christians, and Turks are Muslims.
Huh?
So it was again about them.
Right.
Yeah, and Armenia became a state in the former Soviet Union. But when that dissolved, they became an independent nation, Armenia. But Turkey is going back in. But, I mean, most people don't talk about that either, but I believe it's all related
Yeah.
to Russia, Syria, all what you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and Turkey.
Right. Yeah, it's just there's too many things for these just to be coincidences.
Right.
They can't be. You know, it's amazing. Think about it. When God gave this prophecy, Ezekiel 38, and he foresaw a time when there would be these three, call them relatively major nations, including Russia. There were nobody living there but tribes of people. Magog, which is depicted in Ezekiel 38, were the Scythians who came from the lineage of Noah and his family, his sons, and so forth. So the descendants of Magog ultimately moved up and migrated into what today we know to be Russia. And so that's where Magog came from. It started with the Scythians and then it became Magog. So historically, while they aren't Magog and Gog, certainly Gog, that's another issue. I think that's more a spiritual title for the leader of this confederacy being probably, I think, if not Putin, somebody like Putin. But it's not Magog today or Togarmah. We know that the people, the descendants today, are the ones that originated there are today the Turks. Iran, of course, was Persia, and Magog was what today we know to be Russia. And there's other peripheral nations that may be involved in this. But for the most part, it's Turkey, it's Iran, and it's Russia. So what do we know about Turkey? I mean, we talked a lot about Iran, and we know that Iran's objective is, among other things, to destroy the great and the little Satans. The great Satan being the United States, the little Satan being Israel. Ahmadinejad, the former leader of Iran, made it very known. In fact, he gave a speech at the UN basically advocating the total annihilation of the Jewish people. And so you have to ask yourself, with that mindset to wipe out all the Jewish people, this not being the first time in history that there have been people that desire that, where's it coming from? And you go all the way back to Genesis 3:15, let's just take a look at that again for the 9,000th time. It's basically the first prophecy given in the Bible is after the fall, and God says to Satan, he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. And I think in several of the translations, it's the seed of between your seed and the seed of the woman. Well, wait a minute, what do you mean seed of the woman? The man is the seed, the woman provides the egg. So what is this seed of the woman referencing? Well, it's referencing what would happen 4,000 years later when Jesus Christ came on the scene, born of a virgin. So here you have way back in Genesis 3:15 a prophecy that the enmity between you, Satan, and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, he will crush your head. In other words, that's a metaphor for Jesus Christ being her offspring, will crush the head of Satan's head as well as Antichrist's head, because the seed of Satan is depicted as the future leader of the world, Antichrist. So we see way back here that we have this prophecy about what would happen well into the future. And so getting back to Ezekiel 38, what about Iran? What's going on with Iran? Why the sudden change in their attitude? Well, it's because Erdogan, who is an absolute dictator, nobody really knows what's going on behind the scenes there, but you can imagine that it's probably not a good thing. And what's interesting about Erdogan, and I'll just reference an article here that came out of the World Israel News distribution, where it says that Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan said that Israel's capital city of Jerusalem still belongs to Turkey. So you're going back to the First World War and before, that area over there was the Ottoman Empire, which basically was Turkey that included Jerusalem. And so what Erdogan today is trying to do is to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. It makes no bones about the fact that Jerusalem should be a part of Turkey, that Turkey owns Jerusalem. He goes on to say, this article goes on to say, the surprise remark that Jerusalem belongs to Turkey. The Jerusalem issue is not a geopolitical issue for us. This is Erdogan saying. Jerusalem is our city, a city from us. Erdogan said, referring to the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. In this city, Jerusalem, that we had to leave in tears during the First World War, it's still possible to encounter traces of the Ottoman resistance, Erdogan said. We accepted an honor on behalf of our country and nation to express the rights of the oppressed Palestinian people on every platform. The Ottoman Empire controlled Jerusalem for 400 years until its defeat at the hands of the Western Allies who divided up the former empire. Despite Turkey being a member of NATO, which we just mentioned, relations with Israel have been repeatedly strained under Erdogan, which they weren't before. And so Erdogan comes on the scene, and oh, guess what? He's joining with Russia and Iran, the three main players identified in Ezekiel 38, and certainly has a desire to take not just Jerusalem, but obviously, as they all do, the whole country. So, what's the motivation? And for him, it's to get Jerusalem back. For him, it's to reestablish that Ottoman Empire that was under Turkish rule during the time of World War I and 400 years prior to that. Relations between the two countries took a nosedive in 2010 after 9 Turkish nationals belonging to a radical Islamic group were killed during an IDF raid on the Mai Marmara flotilla. You may have remembered that was trying to illegally violate Israel's blockade of Gaza. Erdogan has tried to assert his influence over the region and has become a patron of the Hamas terror group. So Hamas, which is located in Gaza, which is that little piece of real estate in the southwestern part of, between Egypt and Israel, which is really Israeli territory. But in 2005, they made the mistake of pulling all the Jews that were there out of Gaza and allowing the Hamas basically to run it. And of course, it's become a terrorist camp since that time. Another article about Turkey, and this is just it's just so important and something that's just festering in the Middle East. It's like if people always say, if you want to know where we are on God's prophetic time clock, look to Israel. What's going on with Israel? And we'll see a couple of things as we go through Ezekiel 38 in a moment. But it says, in addition to the disaster that Erdogan brought down on his own country, he's outraged his neighbors in the Fertile Crescent, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Mediterranean basin. The damage he is causing is being discovered in Europe. In Europe, he poses a multifaceted threat. The NATO alliance was established by democratic nations to address the Soviet danger. That's after World War II. Turkey was a little unusual, but gradually developed democratic characteristics, and NATO could depend on its large military. Recently, we have been seeing a stark contrast between the democratic characteristics of most NATO members and Turkey's regime of oppression. Make no mistake, it is an oppressive regime. Erdogan's close ties with Russia, very, very interesting. Here they are a member of NATO, opposed to and trying to protect the world from Russia, but now they are developing ties with each other. And an acquisition of an air defense system that poses a threat to NATO aircraft testify to his intentions. Erdogan isn't even trying to hide the threat to European society in politics in two sensitive areas. Enclaves of Turks and refugees, in other words, allowing refugees to go into France and Germany and Italy and ultimately change the demographics. So we see things like we saw with that French teacher last week. He is blatantly encouraging a process of radicalization among the million Turks who have emigrated to Europe since the 70s, mainly to Germany. The danger he poses to American interests is clear, and it's hard to understand why, this is what I kind of mentioned earlier, why President Trump accepts his outrageous behavior. The damage he has done to NATO hurts the United States too. Weakening European society through radicalized Muslim citizens and a flood of refugees. I mean, these open borders, that's what, the open borders, it comes, that it's all tied into so many different things, not the least of which is this move toward a one world government, globalization. There are no borders. Like the European Union, there's no borders between the nations. So that's what's happening with nations now saying, we don't want borders. And we have politicians in this country that want no borders between us and Mexico and Canada, and it's a death sentence. We have to have borders. That's what Donald Trump's all about. He's a nationalist. That's why they hate him so much, because there was this move toward this one world global network that he interrupted, and it was well on its way. And probably, even though he interrupted it, it's only for a period of time, that it's going to kick back into gear, whether it's now or 4 years from now. But should he lose, we're going to move rapidly into this one world system. There's no question about it. says, Israel has a long list of problems with the anti-Semitic megalomaniac from Ankara. He supports Hamas. He tried to break the maritime weapons blockade on the Gaza Strip and allows terrorists to operate in his country under Turkish passports. He threatens Turkey's most important allies, wages a pan-Islamic war against Israel and Jerusalem, and sends his agents to fight it. In the Mediterranean, he threatens Israel's economic assets as well as its allies. One of the questions that we ask when we talk about Ezekiel 38 is that it says that God will turn them around and put the hooks in their jaws. And what does that mean? That means at the time, at the appropriate time, God is going to motivate somehow the leader of Russia, Gog, to move on Israel with his allies, Turkey and Iran. And you know right now, as we sit here, that Iran and Turkey would, if they were called, they'd do it tomorrow. There's no question. You look at, if anybody listens to Amir on the weekends, I mean, it's one air attack after another taking place in Syria primarily, and in Iran, and in Hezbollah, Libya, not Libya, but where Hezbollah is, North Lebanon. And what it is, it's all attacks against Iran, which is trying to expand their military presence just north of Israel, which is where Ezekiel 38 says this confederacy will come from. And so the question is, what's the hook? What will motivate Russia to move on Israel? Right now they have pretty good relationships, but something's going to happen that will cause them to make this move. And it well could be, and we mentioned this last week, the energy that Israel's now sitting on. Trillions of cubic feet of natural gas that they are beginning to build a pipeline for. They're building a pipeline to go up through Greece and into Europe and to supply natural gas. That's not sitting well with Erdogan. And it's going to have an impact, I believe, on further impact on the Russian economy, because their main source of revenue and income is energy exportation. So we've got this pipeline being developed. We've got Turkey saying that all of that gas belongs to them, all part of that old Ottoman Empire thing, because we are entitled to the Ottoman Empire by default. All that natural gas is ours. And I believe very strongly he's going to do whatever he can to try to prevent it from happening. And we've got Israel right now, fighting these battles with Hezbollah and with Iran proxies and with Gaza. You don't hear much about Turkey, but rest assured that's coming. And I think probably sooner than later. But it's all going to ultimately lead to this invasion of Russia. Aside from his nationalist incitement and oppressive measures, Erdogan is holding on because the economic situation remains tolerable. That's another thing that you don't hear much about. Amir talks a lot about the economies of Iran, particularly Iran. They are absolutely desperate. The value of their currency compared to the dollar is down like 700 times. I mean, it's really, really bad there because of the sanctions and other things that are taking place. So Iran is sitting there, and we've got their own people that are not real happy with the mullahs. So I believe that the mullahs and the leaders of Iran are becoming increasingly desperate to do something. And again, their number one target is Israel. And just exactly like the prophet Ezekiel foresaw 2,600 years ago.
I'm sorry, who's mullahs?
Pardon me?
That's
The leaders, those are the imams, the mullahs, the leaders of the Muslim leaders. Okay. This is where he can be reined in. But for that to happen, we need the Americans to take the lead. Trump hasn't suggested it yet, and Joe Biden will almost certainly not want anything to do with it. So a lot going on there. So the next question is, and we talked a little bit about that last week, is where is American Bible prophecy? This is always a topic that people want to know about. I mean, it's an important one. And let me just go through a couple of scriptures in Ezekiel 38. Let's just walk through it. You know, now's as good a time as any, I guess, to talk about it because it is so relevant. And I think it's probably a good time to dig into this prophecy a little bit more than I had anticipated. But again, we need to get back to the foundations and the formation of Israel and its history, and we will. But it just, I don't know, I think the Lord's laying it on my heart anyway to read through this and see if we can make some sense out of it because it is so relevant today. So I'm starting in Ezekiel 38, and again, if you go to like we said last week in Ezekiel 36, it says God says that He would bring the Israelites, the Jews, back to Israel. He would restore the land. Ezekiel 37 is what's called a prophecy of dry bones prophecy, where the dry bones in Ezekiel 37 represents the coming back to life of Israel, of the Jewish people coming back to life as a nation and coming back into their own land. And so the diaspora of the Jewish people, while they were not in control of Israel, really back in Ezekiel's time, the diaspora, the scattering of the Jewish people, really didn't happen until 70 AD, even up to 135 AD, when the Romans totally devastated Jerusalem. And it was at that point that the Jews who were in Jerusalem, in Israel, for the most part, were scattered throughout the four corners of the earth. Some of them were sold into slavery. And over the 2,000 years between the AD 70 attack and the 135 AD revolt, which was quashed by the Romans, that, and again, many Jews were sold into slavery, and they were virtually cast out of Israel. It was at that time, in AD 35, that, trying to think of the emperor's name of Hadrian, the emperor of, or the, I guess the emperor of, the leader of the Roman Empire, one of the leaders of the Roman Empire who had control over Jerusalem, decided to plow Jerusalem over. The temple had been destroyed, decided to plow it over and change the name of Jerusalem from Jerusalem to Palestina, which is where we get the word Palestine from. The name Palestina was Hadrian, who hated the Jews and hated the Temple Mount in Jerusalem so much that he renamed the city after Israel's arch ancient enemy, the Philistines. And that's where the term Palestinian came from. It's really a pejorative against the, I'm not going to name them Jerusalem. I'm not going to call them Jerusalem anymore because they're despised and we're going to scatter them and so forth. So they were scattered, but in 36, we see where God says, I'm going to bring you back from the four corners of the earth. So they're going to physically return. And then, as we read in the King James, then, after you are brought back, after you are in the process of being brought back, then I will sprinkle clean water on them and give them new hearts. So the sprinkling of the clean water in the new hearts can only happen through a relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, obviously, at this point in time, Jesus had not even come about. But in Ezekiel 37, if we go to verse 24, we read, "My servant David will be king." And David, because Jesus ascended or came from the lineage that of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, down through David, that as we read in Luke, I think it's chapter 3, it says that Jesus will sit upon the throne of his father David, meaning his physical forefather. So it says, my servant David will be king over them. So we have Jesus. That's a reference not to David, but to Jesus. And they will have one shepherd. This is a reference to Israel, that at some point in time, which has not yet happened, they will have one shepherd. They will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. And of course, God implemented the law, the 10 Commandments, and the Jewish do's and don'ts, saying that it was a bilateral agreement that the Jews had to obey the commands in order to be blessed, and if they weren't, they didn't obey him, they would be cursed. And so what the Israelites proved in no uncertain terms is they were not obedient. They couldn't be obedient. Because we said, and Jesus said that to look upon a woman with lust is to, you've already committed adultery. So according to his standards, that it couldn't be done. So in other words, the law proved that the works would never work. And so it says, they will follow my laws. So the only way they could follow his laws and keep his decrees was that at some point, Israel will acknowledge their Messiah. And that happens during the second half, but largely at the very end of the tribulation. The Jews are going to be persecuted in that last 3.5 years of the tribulation, unlike any time in history. We read in Zechariah chapter 13 that 2/3 of the Jews during that period of time are going to be killed. 2/3 are going to be executed. Now, some people say, well, what about the Holocaust? The Holocaust was not 2/3. It was somewhere around 40 to 50% of the Jews perished during the Holocaust. There's never been a point in time when 2/3 have perished. So that's what's going to happen during the second half of the tribulation. And then at the very end of the tribulation, Armageddon takes place. Armageddon being all the nations of the world gathered together in the valley of Megiddo to move on Jerusalem and to finally wipe out Israel under the leadership of Antichrist. It's at that point that Jesus comes back. It's not when we get caught up to meet him. We will be with him at that point in time. So this is the very end. Jesus returns physically, and the whole world will see him coming back with thousands upon thousands upon thousands of saints, us, with him. And it's at that point, as we read in Zechariah, that the Israelites, will recognize the one they pierced. So it's at that point in time that the Jews who are remaining, and it's a little bit nebulous, just uncertain as to exactly how many and so on and so forth, because Romans 11 does say all Israel will be saved, and most would say that's all of the Jews who survive until the time Jesus returns. But at any rate, there's going to come a point in time when every Jew on the face of the earth, when Jesus comes back, will see him, recognize he's the one that they pierced, and Jesus, will become their God. That's when the clean water will be sprinkled on them, and he will give them the new hearts. That's what happens when we're born again, born of the Spirit. We had a new heart. And it's not the flesh, it's the heart. It's grace that operates through us. So they will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. So now we're looking at the time into the millennial kingdom, so to speak. Then in verse 25, they will live in the land I gave to my servant Jacob. So this is a promise again that the land that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and we saw that it's an everlasting promise that the land is theirs, that he will give them the land at that point in time. They and their children and their children's children will live there forever. And David, my servant, will be their prince forever. Remember in Isaiah chapter 7, where it talks about the Prince of Peace coming back and so on and so forth. He will be their Israel's peace. He's going to be the leader of the world. He's going to rule from Jerusalem the entire world, very much a righteous manner. Will be my servant, will be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace with them, and it will be an everlasting covenant. So now he's referring back to the Abrahamic covenant, which is everlasting, and where he said way back to Abraham that I will give them the land, and what? I will be their God. And so this is that fulfillment, that he is going to be their God. I will establish them and increase their numbers, and I will put my sanctuary among them forever. So throughout the Old Testament, the sanctuary was the temple. The first temple was known as the sanctuary, as was the second temple. So the sanctuary here during the tribulation, or during the kingdom age, is going to be a brand new temple that's going to be built in Jerusalem, that Jesus himself is going to rule from in perfect righteousness by himself. He's not going to need any help. It's going to be an absolute monarchy, but a monarchy based on love and righteousness and perfect justice. Everything will be perfect. And when Jesus comes back and rules for that 1,000-year period, he's going to restore the earth. I think that during the 1,000-year period, I think it's going to be, I think the earth is going to go back to what it was, what Eden was like. Just absolutely perfect in all respects. I will make a covenant of peace with them, and which, got to remember that this is all about Israel. He's going to make a peace with Israel. Does that mean that the Gentiles aren't important? Absolutely not. We, because of Israel and the covenant that God established with them, with Israel, are grafted into those promises. We're all under grace now. This was still the Old Testament, but now that Jesus has come, it's all grace. And the only way anybody can be saved, Jew, Gentile, or Jew or Gentile, is through the shed blood of Jesus Christ. But he's referring to Israel here. It will be an everlasting covenant. I will increase them and increase their numbers, and I will put my sanctuary among them forever. My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God. They will be my people. He's not their God right now, for the most part. There are certainly Jews that have accepted Jesus Christ. We all, many of us, again, listen to our mayor and other born-again Jewish people. So there are Jews that have accepted him, but for the most part, they have not. They've been blinded to the gospel because they did reject their Messiah. But those blinders are going to come off at some point in time. Then the nations will know that I, the Lord, make Israel holy when my sanctuary is among them forever. So he scattered them. He brings them back into the land in unbelief. After that, he's going to cleanse them and sprinkle them and cleanse their hearts and so forth. And then before all of that happens, I believe we have this Magog Gog prophecy that we read about in Ezekiel 38. So this, and I say that because I believe very strongly, as do most people that study this prophecy, and there are people that you could go so in depth into Ezekiel 38 and 39. I was just reviewing before I came here tonight a study done by Don Stewart. Anybody know him? Who did a probably 150-page treatise just on Ezekiel 38 and 39. There's so much to it but anyway, we're gonna hit it from a high level because that's as far as I can go. It's from a very high level. I'm not capable of going down below that. So Ezekiel 38. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of Man. So, Son of Man here is a reference to Ezekiel. Ezekiel's often referred to as the Son of Man. Set your face against Gog. Gog being the spiritual, Gog is, we see Gog again later at the end of the tribulation, but this Gog this I believe is probably a demon who is going to control the leader of this confederacy of the land of Magog. Magog, without getting too much more involved in that, clearly is Russia. The chief prince or leader, so Gog is the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you. Well, I don't know as I'd want God against me. But the leader of Magog, of Gog, is clearly, and we have to understand, God knows people's hearts. And some might say, well, I thought God loved everybody. Well, he's against Gog because he knows Gog is never going to be a spirit-filled individual. He knows that. Chief prince of Meshach and I will turn you around. So notice, like with most, I think virtually all prophecies regarding the return of Christ, notice the personal pronoun I. I, God, will turn you, Meshach, Tubal, Gog, around. In other words, picture Russia, kind of the Confederacy and God kind of facing north toward Moscow or whatever. And so God's going to do something. He's going to cause them to turn around, put hooks in your jaws and bring you out with your whole army. So in other words, somehow God's going to motivate them, probably very quickly, very suddenly. Something's going to happen or some situation's going to take place. And there's so many possibilities. For example, the gas, the oil, Syria becoming destroyed, who knows what, that's going to motivate, that God's going to use to motivate this confederacy to move on Israel and bring you out with your whole army, your horses, your horsemen, fully armed in a great horde with large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. So people say, well, is this going to be like old-fashioned weapons? Well, I think that God, through Ezekiel, had to relate the weaponry to the types of weapons that existed at that time. And when it says fully armed, up here, your horsemen fully armed in a great horde, what that's saying is there's going to be a huge number of troops and very sophisticated weapons that are going to be a part of this. And then when you add to it Persia is, in verse 5, Iran. And we know what Iran's motivation is today. Cush being Libya. Libya suddenly is in cahoots with Turkey. That's just something that's been developed because Libya is in an absolute, or as I guess, yeah, or as I get it, because Cush is of Libya and Put is North Sudan. So all Muslim nations, with the exception of Russia, that are going to come against Israel. And we have, again, Russia, Persia, Iran, and Turkey all coming together. And Put will be with them, all with their shields, helmet, Gomer, with all his troops, Beth, Togarmah, that is Turkey. So in connection with Russia and Persia, Iran, is Turkey from the far north. If you go to a map and you pinpoint Jerusalem, Israel, and you go due north, what do you run into? Russia. You can't get any further north than Siberia, Russia, and whatever else is up there. With all its troops and with the nations ready, the nations with you. Get ready, be prepared, you and all the hordes gathered about you, and take command of them after many days. So that's very telling. After many days means just that, at some point in the future. So it's still yet future because nothing like this has ever happened. There's never been an invasion or an attempted invasion of Israel by these nations. You will be called to arms. Who's going to call them to arms? God. in the future years. So another affirmation that this is at some point in the future. And I believe with what we're seeing in Syria, with Russia, with Israel finding the gas, with Libya and Turkey kind of connected, Turkey with its desires for Jerusalem and its desire to basically take back the Ottoman Empire, including places like Greece and other places that they once controlled. I mean, we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg of this guy, I think. After many days, future years, you will invade a land that has recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations. So in order for this event to take place, the Jews have to be back in the land. They have been gathered from many nations. And think about that. I mean, we have the benefit of looking back in time and saying, wow, that's exactly what's happened. But Ezekiel, he had no idea what he was saying here. I mean, Jerusalem was still in a state of, it was still desolate, having been basically destroyed and the temple destroyed by the Babylonians. It was during that same time period, because you go back to very beginning, you see that Ezekiel was writing from the Babylonian Empire. Say to the gathered many nations to the mountains of Israel. So one of the questions people have, what's that mean, mountains of Israel? All these nations, picture all these nations to the north, the south, from virtually every direction, moving on Israel. So when it says the mountains of Israel, I believe what that's saying is they're just going to barely penetrate into Israel. They're going to get to the mountains and they're going to penetrate toward Israel. And Israel at this point in time, they're going to know this is happening, obviously. This is the whole world because we have the benefit of modern media. They're going to say, we're done. We're toast. We're on the brink. We can't, as powerful as Israel is, and who knows, maybe they'll be tempted to use nuclear weapons, I don't know, but they're going to say, that's it, we're done, we're toast. And that's exactly what God wants them to think, and we'll see that as we go further. To the mountains of Israel, which has long been desolate. So at the time Ezekiel's writing, it was desolate. For 2,000 years after the diaspora and the destruction, it was desolate. So today it's not desolate. Israel's no longer desolate. They have been brought back from the nations, as I mentioned before. Israel, Jews have come back to Israel from more than 100 different nations after 2,000 plus years. You can't make this up. How could that be? The only way it could be would be if God protected them and if God kept them from becoming extinct or being assimilated into other cultures. And now all of them live in safety. So that question is, does Israel today think they live in safety? I think they do because they're so strong militarily. I think it's a mindset that they may have, and they are. I'm not sure that they are in safety right now, but I can tell you that the other nations, and when you read this, you realize pretty quickly that Syria is not involved in this. Lebanon, Hezbollah is not involved in this. Certainly Arabia, Saudi Arabia, those nations aren't involved. Egypt's not involved. Gaza doesn't appear to be involved. So these other nations, they're not involved because they have been so weakened and their economies are desolate and desperate and they're really no match for Israel. So they think they're in safety. I believe that they are safe. You and all your troops and the many nations with you will go up, advancing like a storm. And so this huge, who knows how many hundreds of thousands of troops, like a storm cloud moving on Israel. It would be like a cloud covering the land. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On that day, thoughts will come into your mind and you will devise an evil scheme. So at that time, we're in that time today, the only thing that's missing, and who knows what's going on behind the scenes, who knows what's going on between Erdogan and Iran and Russia, Putin. Who knows what kind of scheme they may be currently formulating? It wouldn't surprise me if this future attack's already been developed. It's probably in the planning stages, if not ready to be just waiting for it to take place, waiting for God to put the hook in the jaw. You will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. So at the time Ezekiel was writing, of course, they built walls around villages and cities to protect them from marauders and invaders. Israel's clearly has no walled villages now. It will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and gates and bars. I will plunder and loot and turn my hand against the resettled ruins. Resettled ruins. That's pretty interesting when you look at what Israel is today. That those ruins have been resettled. In fact, the ruins, many of the ancient ruins, have been uncovered, and the land, the agriculture and so forth has been developed. The people gathered from the nations, rich in livestock gathered from the nations. Again, another affirmation that the Jewish people have come back from all the nation. Rich in livestock and goods, living at the center of the land. Now, here's something really, really interesting, and another reason why this has become so relevant. Sheba and Dedan. So what are Sheba and Dedan? Those are what today we know to be the Arabian Peninsula. That's Saudi Arabia, Oman, the Emirates, Bahrain. It talks about Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, we'll talk about that in a moment, and her villages will say to you, have you come to plunder? So that's very significant because these other nations, Sheba, Dedan, Saudi Arabia, all they're going to do is just, they're not offering to defend Israel or to battle against this confederacy. They're just saying, why are you doing this? Are you coming to take a plunder, or coming to plunder, to take something? What are you doing it for? In other words, it's just, okay, but we're not gonna lift a hand to help them. And what's interesting is that Sheba and Dedan are represented by those nations that are developing relations with Israel today. Again, the Emirates, Bahrain, some talk that Saudi Arabia may jump on board, even Sudan, which is that's a question mark how that could happen. But other nations are talking about developing treaties with Israel, peace treaties and agreements and economic agreements. But what people don't realize, number one, is a lot of these agreements have stipulated that that the Palestinians be given territory, be given a land, be given a state. And that's one of the things that's preventing Saudi Arabia from Saudi Arabia allows flights and so forth, and Saudi Arabia needs Israel. They need their military capabilities because Saudi Arabia is an Iranian target. Remember just a few years ago that Iran took out a bunch of their oil wells. And so Saudi Arabia is scared to death of Iran. So one of the things that motivates these nations to team up with Israel is the Iranian threat, the Shia versus Sunnis. And, go back to Ishmael and Ishmael's sons. And God said that Ishmael will be a wild donkey of a man fighting with his brothers. And then he said, or there was a prophecy given to Ishmael's sons that became the fathers or the forefathers of all the Arab nations, said the same thing. You will be wild donkeys of men fighting against your brothers. And so it's exactly what's happening. But we've got Sheba and Dedan. So I believe that while these deals with the Emirates and so forth are taking place, there's no indication, and I don't believe that they would ever raise a finger to help Israel when this confederacy, when this takes place. But they're peaceful with them. All the more reason that Israel could think that, when we see the words peace, they're living peaceful and unsuspecting people back up in verse 11, that word peaceful really is probably better stated as in security. They think they're in peace and security. And so what this does is it allows or helps Israel to realize that they do have peaceful religion or relations with Muslim nations, but they're not going to come to their rescue. So I don't think that what's happening over there with these latest developments is a coincidence. It's all part and parcel to what's coming. It's all being set up. God's putting the pieces in place. The merchants of Tarshish. So the big question people ask is, what is Tarshish? Well, there's been a lot of studies done, and some believe that Tarshish could be Spain. Others believe, and I think there's pretty good evidence to support, that Tarshish is what we know today as Great Britain. And if it is Great Britain, then that becomes very interesting, because it says, the merchants of Tarshish and all her villages, and in the King James says, her young lions will say to you. Okay, so I think the King James is a much better translation, because it's saying that Tarshish, along with all of those nations that came from Great Britain, if Great Britain in fact is Tarshish, and it's subject to some discussion, I guess, but there's certainly evidence to support that Tarshish could be Great Britain. We're one of Great Britain's young lions. We came from Great Britain. We started our forefathers came from England. And so the United States very well could be a young lion of Tarshish. And what's interesting is it's put into the same bucket, Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, or villages or young lions, will say to the Confederacy, have you come to plunder? Or in some translations, to take a spoil. Again, why are you doing this? Have you gathered your hoards to loot, to carry off silver and gold, or to take away livestock and goods, and to seize much plunder? Possibly have you come to take control of the gas supplies that Israel now has? Like we said, trillions of cubic feet. Could that be the hook that is motivating them to come? What's interesting is, if the United States, in fact, is a young lion of Tarshish, we're not coming to the rescue. We're right there with Sheba and Dedan, just basically asking the question, why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't, right now, if it were to happen tomorrow with President Trump in office, that we would send troops over there. Something has to happen, I believe, to relegate the United States to no longer be the world's superpower. Something has to happen. Otherwise, it only stands to reason that we're and have been since '48 Israel's #1 ally. Granted, we've had the Obama administrations and others that are were obviously very anti-Israel, but as it stands right now, we know what President Trump has done for Israel, and we know that Pompeo and Mike Pence and others are very strong Christians who know full well the significance of Israel. So something's got to happen. And if this event, and you think about the fact that all of the pieces are in place with Russia, Iran, Turkey, Libya, all in place, getting ready to be fulfilled, how close is it? How close are we as a country to being knocked off our pedestal? And what is it going to be? What's it going to take? again, this isn't me speaking, I'm just kind of speculating, but most people I've read, most people who know far more than I do say basically the same thing. Something's going to cause the United States, whether it's an economic catastrophe, whether it's an electromagnetic attack, what could be the rapture. It could be the rapture of the church. That, I mean, you think about the population of the Christian population throughout the world, that the majority of Christians, there are more Christians percentage-wise, granted today it's probably only 8 to 10%, but there are more Christians in the United States than any other place. So if the church was suddenly removed, then that would certainly portend, or could be the motivation that causes this confederacy to make its move. I believe, my guess, and who knows, God doesn't provide all the specifics, but with everything that's lining up, if in fact it's the rapture that causes this to take place, and again, I think many scholars, and different scholars have different views, and again, that's the way that God set it up, you know. And in Acts 17:11, he encourages us to be like the Bereans, that when Paul spoke and taught, the Bereans were a group of scholars that went back and tested the scriptures to make sure what Paul was saying was accurate. So we all need to be Bereans. We need to be, certainly whatever I say, make sure you go back and you're checking that against what the scriptures actually say. And it doesn't matter who it is. We need to make sure that that things line up with scripture. Now, this is one of those areas that's a little bit fuzzy, but I think it clearly states and stands to reason that with things that are happening, and I mean, you get to the United States, we'll talk about all of the signs coming together and coming together very quickly, that we're close. And this event in the Middle East is close. I know there are some people that are very worried about what Iran could do before Election Day. I personally think that they hope that Joe Biden wins. Because if he does, Biden's already said he will re-enter that crazy Iran deal that Trump got out of. So I don't think anything's going to happen before, but who knows? I mean, it's God's in charge. He's the one that's orchestrating all these events, right? So questions, comments, we'll pick up on this next week. Again, I didn't plan to do this for a couple of months anyway, but we'll figure something out. All right, does it make sense? A lot happening.
Isn't put Libya?
Pardon me?
Isn't put Libya?
Yeah, I think puts Libya and Cush's Sudan. You're right. You're right. Yep.
And Cush is.
I knew it was one or the other. I had a little brain freeze there, Jeff.
Well, that's why I gotta check on you.
Appreciate it. I need it. Anybody else? Okay, let's just close in prayer. Father, we just thank you for this time, and Lord, we sure live in interesting times. As a Christian, I don't know if I would rather live today watching your grand plan come together, or if I'd rather have lived when you were here the first time. I mean, either one is exciting, and we do live, as perilous as things may seem, we live in very exciting times, and we're watching your hand, Lord. If there's any proof anywhere of your existence, any proof that you are who you say you are, it's in prophecy, Lord, and it's in what's happening throughout the world. Things are happening exactly as you said they would, and we just praise you for that. And just thank you, Lord, that we have the privilege of being able to at least scratch the surface on these fascinating topics. So, Lord, I just pray for everyone here. Bring us back next week. And I pray that you bring us back safe and sound. I pray for our families and do so in Jesus' precious name. Amen.